Just after 10 in the morning on December 6, 1907, something moved through mine number 8 faster than any man could run. It was not one event, it was two. The first explosion ripped through a section of number 8. Almost immediately, a second blast followed. It traveled underground, through the shaft connecting number 8 to neighboring mine number 6. The main entrance of mine number 6 collapsed. The ventilation system that served both mines was gone. In the tunnels, which covered 700 acres of underground workings, there was nothing moving except fire and gas. At least 362 men were inside. That is the official number. The Mine Safety and Health Administration lists Monongah as the worst coal mine disaster in the history of the United States. 362 deaths, December 6, 1907. But the official count cannot be fully trusted, not because of fraud, not because of suppression. Because the board that recorded who had entered the mine that morning, the numbered token board that proved a man was underground, was destroyed in the first explosion. The record was gone before the investigation began. The coroner counted 357 bodies accounted for. West Virginia's state record settled on 361. The Mine Safety and Health Administration uses 362. Italian community records, cross-referenced with parish lists from the villages where miners had stopped writing home, suggest the real number may have been somewhere between 400 and 500. That range is not a clerical error. It is the shape of the problem. This is not a rounding problem. 5 people is not the margin. The margin is the invisible workers, the ones the board never recorded. An official investigation produced an official count. 117 years later, no one can verify it. This episode follows a single question, not what happened on December 6, 1907. But how did Monongah become both a mass casualty disaster and a record-keeping failure? And why does it matter that the investigation could not answer that question? The Mine Safety and Health Administration ranks American coal mine disasters by death toll. Monongah is first. It has been first since the list was compiled, but MSHA's count is 362. The coroner who examined the bodies in December 1907 recorded 357. The difference, 5 people, represents what the investigation could reconcile. What it could not reconcile was larger. The gap between 362 and the possible 400 or 500 is not statistical noise. It is the consequence of a system that did not count certain workers. To understand why, the story has to move from the death toll to the system that produced it. That begins in Monongah in 1907. Monongah sits in Marion County, West Virginia, 6 miles south of Fairmont on the West Fork River. In 1907, it was a working town built around coal. The hills around it held some of the most productive seams in West Virginia. The Fairmont Coal Company operated 2 mines on the same hillside, number 6 and number 8. They had separate entrances, separate token boards, separate inspection records. Underground, they were one continuous system. The company had joined the 2 mines through a connecting shaft that allowed both to be ventilated from a single infrastructure. It was an efficiency decision, 1 ventilation circuit instead of 2. It reduced cost. It also meant that anything moving through one mine's workings had an open path into the other. The workforce that entered those mines in December 1907 had come from across the world. Italian immigrants, many from the southern regions of Molise and Calabria, formed the largest single group. In the villages they had left behind, parish records and family registers tracked the letters that arrived from West Virginia. Families waited for money, for news, for proof that the crossing had been worth the distance. Hungarian workers came from villages of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Polish, Russian, and Serbian miners had settled alongside older American families in Monongah's neighborhoods. They had come for coal wages, and the wages required a price the system did not advertise. Miners in 1907 were not paid by the hour. They were paid by the ton. A miner's earnings were a direct function of how much coal he cut. Working alone meant limited income. The way to increase output and bring home enough money was to have more hands at the coalface. So older miners brought their sons. Teenage boys and younger relatives came underground as helpers. They loaded coal into tram cars, carried tools, picked slate, and performed the labor that kept a family's tonnage moving. Many of these helpers did not appear in the official employment records. Many did not appear on the token board. Accounts from the period suggest some workers were boys as young as 8. The practice was not a secret. It was the economic logic of the labor system applied to underground work. What it meant in December 1907 was that the roster of men who had entered the mine that morning was not an accurate count, and the board that tracked them was about to be destroyed. The warning chain in Monongah needs precision because it did not look like a hidden memo or a suppressed report. It looked like an ordinary mine. That is the point. In the workings of mine number 6 and mine number 8, miners carried open flame lamps. By 1907, the relationship between exposed flame and methane ignition was not a new discovery. Mining engineers in Britain and Germany had documented the danger for decades. Safety lamps, sealed designs that shielded the flame, were in standard use in parts of Europe. American mining had not moved uniformly to sealed lamps. Compliance was uneven. No federal body had authority to require it. The decision to join mine number 6 and mine number 8 through a shared ventilation system created a continuous underground corridor. Under normal operating conditions, this meant one fan, one circuit, one infrastructure cost. Under explosion conditions, it meant that a fireball forming in one section of number 8 had a direct path into the 700 acres of workings on the other side. The connection was not a design flaw that had gone unnoticed. It was the intended design. By 1907, engineers and mine operators understood that coal dust suspended in air could sustain and amplify an explosion far beyond its origin point. The remedy, wetting the hallway floors and walls or applying rock dust, was documented and used in some operations. In Monongah's mines, as in many American operations of the era, the practice was inconsistent. The hallways were dry. The walls held accumulated dust. An October 6th inspection, just 60 days before the explosion, recorded no traces of gas in mine number 8 and only a slight trace of dust in mine number 6. The inspector filed his report. The mines continued working. 60 days later, the explosion in number 8 would travel miles through those hallways. Because miners were paid by the ton, the pressure to bring unofficial helpers underground was constant. The token board was the mechanism of accountability, but unofficial helpers, unregistered boys, and relatives who came to help did not always take tokens. The board did not always reflect the population of the mine. In December 1907, the United States had no federal mine safety agency. There was no Bureau of Mines. West Virginia had mine inspectors, but their authority was limited. Their inspections were periodic, and their findings were not backed by enforcement mechanisms equivalent to what would come later. The blasting procedures at Monongah were standard. The ventilation design met the requirements of 1907. The inspection had passed. Not one of these facts excuses what happened. In Monongah on December 6, 1907, 5 ordinary conditions were present at the same time, and they converge. The first explosion moved through mine number 8 just after 10 in the morning. The exact source of ignition was never established with certainty. Chief Inspector James W. Paul concluded that the cause was a blown-out shot inflaming the dust, an explosive charge that failed to direct its force into the coal seam and instead ejected fire back into the mine atmosphere. The coroner's jury agreed, recording that the explosion was caused by either what is commonly known as a blown-out shot or by the igniting and explosion of powder in mine number 8. An open flame lamp could have provided the same ignition. So could an electrical arc, or a spark from a tramcar wheel on a rail. What can be stated with confidence is what happened next. The coal dust in the hallways of mine number 8 was dry. The atmosphere contained methane, seeping from the coal seams. When the fireball formed, it found fuel. The dust in the crosscuts and entries caught and amplified the initial event. What may have begun as a local blast in one heading became a traveling detonation moving through the length of the workings. Then it reached the shaft connecting mine number 8 to mine number 6. The explosion entered number 6. A second, larger blast followed. The entrance to mine number 6 collapsed. The shared ventilation system was destroyed. Without ventilation, the mines filled with carbon monoxide and afterdamp. Men who had survived the initial blast faced the air that follows underground fire. No trained rescue team was stationed at Monongah. When news reached neighboring communities, miners came from Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Ohio. Many were immigrants themselves. They arrived with picks and shovels and began working through 700 acres of underground workings that were still burning, still gas-filled, and partly collapsed. The recovery took days. In some sections, it took weeks. This is the point where the record begins to fracture. The token board was gone. The employment roster had not tracked all workers. The boys who had come down as helpers, the cousins and younger brothers who carried coal and did not take tokens. None of them were in a document that survived. The investigation could count recovered bodies. It could not determine who was still underground. It could not close the total. West Virginia's mine inspector attributed the explosion to accumulation of dust. The Federal Geological Survey's representative offered several possible ignition sources: the blown-out shot, an electrical arc, an open flame, or a tramcar accident, without ruling any of them in or out definitively. Inspector Paul's conclusion, the blown-out shot, was the most specific. It named a mechanism. It was the finding the coroner's jury adopted. But a blown-out shot is an explanation for the ignition, not for the disaster. What turned a local blast into a catastrophe across two connected mines was the coal dust, the methane, and the connecting shaft. The investigation understood this. Federal engineers who came to study Monongah in the following years documented exactly how those three factors had interacted. Bureau of Mines bulletins from the early 1910s cited Monongah repeatedly when arguing for rock dusting, stricter blasting procedures, and separation of ventilation systems. The disaster was useful to the engineers who came after it. The death toll conflict ran through the investigation without resolution. The coroner had recorded 357 bodies identified or accounted for. State records settled on 361 or 362. MSHA's table uses 362. Meanwhile, the Italian consul in Pittsburgh came to Monongah to help identify victims. Italian newspapers covered the disaster extensively. In the decades that followed, commemorative projects in Italian-American communities and in southern Italian villages attempted to reconstruct the full victim list from immigration records, church registries, and family accounts. In the villages of Molise and Calabria, families noted the men who had stopped writing home in December 1907. Those reconstructions arrive at numbers that do not match the official count. The gap cannot be proven. It may never be proven, but it is consistent with what is known. The checkboard was destroyed, the roster had gaps, and the unofficial workers were never on any document that survived the blast. The investigation produced a probable cause. It produced a partial count. It could not do more than that with the materials it had. At least 216 women in Monongah lost their husbands. At least 475 children lost their fathers. Some accounts suggest these figures are also conservative, for the same reason the death toll is conservative. The unofficial workers who died left no official record of dependents either. Andrew Carnegie made a donation to relief efforts. The American Red Cross coordinated fundraising. The Fairmont Coal Company's legal liability was governed by the standards of 1907. Monongah was not the only disaster that month. By December's end, the Senate had received reports of 4 major disasters in a single month. An explosion at the Dar Mine in Jacobs Creek, Pennsylvania, killed 239 men 17 days after Monongah. 2 more followed before December ended. By the close of 1907, 3,941 American miners had been killed that year, a figure that Bureau of Mines engineers and later historians would identify as the highest single-year toll in the recorded history of American coal mining. Theodore Roosevelt had been pressing Congress for years to create a federal agency with authority over mine safety. The Monongah disaster moved that argument. Jacobs Creek moved it further. In 1908, Roosevelt sent Congress a formal request. In 1910, the Bureau of Mines was established. Its earliest major technical work included a systematic study of how the Monongah explosion had moved through the connected mine system and what that implied for every other operation in the country that shared ventilation infrastructure. The Bureau could investigate. For its first years, it could not enforce. The enforcement came in stages, culminating in the Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act of 1969 and the Expanded Act of 1977. In broader American memory, Monongah competed with a year of economic panic, 4 disasters in 1 month, and headlines that move fast. The immigrant dead were not easily gathered into a single national story. In 2009, 102 years after the explosion, the United States Senate passed Resolution 337, designating December 6th as National Miners' Day. The resolution referenced Monongah by name. The official recognition came. The cause of the explosion was still listed in every official source as unproven. What can be established about the Monongah disaster is this. Two mines were deliberately connected underground to share one ventilation circuit. The economic logic was sound. The safety consequence was a corridor through which any ignition could travel between two separate operations. The workforce inside those mines included men and boys who were not on any official record, a consequence of a labor system that paid by the ton and made invisible labor economically rational. The inspection 60 days before the explosion found no gas and only slight traces of dust. The mines were cleared to operate. 2 months later, the conditions in those hallways contributed to a detonation that covered 700 acres. The safety standards of 1907 permitted open flames underground in methane-bearing workings. They permitted dry hallways. They permitted shared ventilation systems. They did not require a federal inspector with authority to act. The blasting procedures at Monongah were standard. The ventilation design met the requirements of 1907. The inspection had passed. Not one of these facts excuses the outcome. When the first blast moved through mine number 8, those conditions were not created by that blast. They were already there. The dust in the hallways, the methane in the seams, the connection to mine number 6, the absence of sealed lamps, the absence of a federal inspector with authority, all of it was in place before anyone lit a shot. The investigation concluded that the cause was probably a blown-out shot. It may have been. What the investigation could not conclude was that the cause mattered more than the conditions. The Monongah disaster did not begin on December 6, 1907. It began when two mines were connected to save one ventilation circuit. It continued when open flame lamps remained in operation while safer designs existed elsewhere. It was made final when a workforce was allowed to grow invisible, when the boys who carried coal were not on the board and the board itself could be erased in a single blast. 362 is the number that entered the official record. It may not be the number that entered the mine. That distance between what was built and what was counted was not closed by the investigation. It has not been closed since.